Hello. I pull up the questions on my phone. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Jahnice Cajigas. I'm the Director of Organizing for the Citywide Youth Coalition here in New Haven, Connecticut, and also the co-founder and co-director of the Connecticut Black and Brown Queer Camp. Today we will be having a conversation around pride and queer identity, specifically focused on creating radical spaces for LGBTQ young people. We have two panelists with us today. We'll start with the amazing Dave.
I'm Dave. I use he pronouns. I'm an organizer at Sunrise New Haven and the operations apprentice at Citywide Youth Coalition.
And next we have Mia.
Hey you all, I'm Mia. I'm a college student. I'm a former organizer turned marketing person. And I haven't done organizing in a while, but I am someone.
Nice. So yeah, as the panel is going, we definitely invite people, if you have questions, to drop them in the chat. And as the moderator, I'll make sure to get that question to the panelists. And yeah, just feel free to fully engage in the conversation as we move forward. So right, talking specifically about creating radical spaces for queer young people, I would like to hear from Dave and Mia as the panelists. What do you guys define as radical, right? Because there's so many definitions for it, but I'd like to hear from you both. Like, what is your definition of radical?
Radical it definitely involves, in my opinion, a lot of abolition. Radical is something that's, a lot of times when people bring up the word radical, people often get scared as a first instinct. But like radical is something that's necessary. Radical, in my viewpoint, is liberation. It's freedom, right? Especially like as queer people, radical just means us not having to assimilate into a cis heteronormative society, where basically that means it's seen as normal to be cisgendered or to be heterosexual, and you see that everywhere in media. So radical for me is a lot of abolition, it's liberation, it's something out of the norm, but very much necessary.
Mia?
I think my definition is more broad in terms of just it is anything that goes against the social mores, the social order of like whatever goes against what is du jour, right? Which is like of the day. And that can take on any meeting. That can literally be like, I'm gonna do this, well, everyone does this, or I identify as this, but everyone else identifies as something else. Whatever that means, because there is no one definition, because it varies from person to person. And I like Dave's idea, and I think I very much agree with what they're saying. And I would just expand that to mean non-conformism, in effect.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like within the LGBTQ rights liberation movement, like if you go back to the earlier days, like there's so many great examples of like what radical looks like, right? Like Stonewall was radical. Gene Compton's riots were radical, right? So I think we have so many great examples of what radical could be and what it looks like. Um, Now, oftentimes, there are a lot of organizations, nonprofits, who are looking to create um, safe spaces and radical safe spaces for LGBTQ youth, right? And often these spaces are created by adults, right? Who also deal with their own internalized adultism, right? And it often shows up in their interactions with young people. So I was wondering, as young people, what can adults do who run youth spaces to check their adultism every day? Dave or Mia, whichever one.
Pops into my head is one, just back up. I think it's very easy to get very, very involved in youth spaces, and it just makes it harder for youth to speak up when they see forms of adultism. And sometimes adults just need to give space to youth. Creating space is also involves giving space away, letting that space be out of your control, basically. And really just take a step back and evaluate what you're saying. Like, I usually don't like saying kind of vague terms like that, like evaluate what you're saying, check yourself, but it's something that needs to be done with intention, and you can only do that by taking time away, by stepping back from that space. Because youth also need to be able to develop and grow on their own, to get to know themselves on their own. So I think a big part of keeping adultism away is also taking a step back from the space and talking with intention, and really looking and asking yourself, what kind of internal bias do I have? Like, how have my experiences contributed to that bias as well, that may be harming the youth that are in my space?
Thank you. Mia?
Questions like these really tend to drive me nuts, of like, what can white people do to help black people? What can cis people do to help trans people? What, like, and it's always just like, give up power, man. Like, I don't, that that is the easy answer. And it has to be, and it sounds extreme, but like radical, we were just talking about radicalism, like radical questions, problems need radical, extreme solutions. And you have to be okay and fully understand that, like, you're not going to have the power, because you don't need that power, because you, and by you, I mean like whatever system, institution, nonprofits in this case, need to be okay with the fact that, like, you have too much power, you need to share, you need to like loosen your iron grip, you know what I mean? Like, it's not just we're going to do panels and stuff with these marginalized folks to bring them in. It's like, you need them in leadership, you need them as CEOs, you need them doing outreach, you need them in these central positions, hell, you need them in the treasury, like you need them in every area for it to be truly considered like diverse, inclusive, something that is really progressive, as you would want to call yourself. You know what I mean?
Mia brought that up, and when we do talk about white people and BIPOC spaces, we always bring up, you shouldn't be centering yourself. You should be an ally and just an ally. because your experiences do tamper with the movements of BIPOC people, and BIPOC movements often get co-opted as well when white experiences are centered in a movement. So I think that can also be translated into queer youth and adults. Don't center yourself, just be an ally alongside youth, giving them support, giving them guidance when they look like they might need it or when they ask for it. But don't center yourself in the space, whatever space it may be.
Yes,
It's
and I
really
would
not
challenge
about
us, and I would challenge us to go beyond allyship and into co-conspirators, right? Folks who are actively working to support those who are most marginalized. Um, so the next question is, we know historically, right, that within the LGBTQ community, um, there has been some serious issues around anti-blackness and racism, right, which has resulted in queer people of color creating their own spaces, right? Like when we talk about the drag balls in New York City, right? And you talk about people like Crystal LaBeija who like went on to create this whole underground ballroom scene specifically for LGBTQ folks of color, right? So we know often, even within like our own LGBT community, we're not accepted because we're black, brown, whatever the case may be. Um, and often that translates into how these spaces that we are creating for young people are created. So I was wondering if there was some experiences that you all could tap into of like queer spaces where you felt fully welcomed as a LGBTQ young person and also as a person of color. We could start with Mia.
No, let me stop.
Love
So,
you.
uh, I won't lie. That's a very hard question because even within the LGBTQ community and even within LGBTQ spaces of color, I feel there's still a lot of ignorance, there's still a lot of inner division, there's a lot of like, well, like we're LGB, but we don't care for trans folks, or like it's like transphobia one week and then biphobia another week and then asphobia another week and then panphobia, like, and that's not to be negative, it's just that like I also tend to be critical of those spaces because I find that a lot of the issues that we try to get away from we end up kind of bringing in, and I don't think that's really, fun. And sometimes there are places where like acceptance, most times, at least for me, I feel like acceptance is very, very hard because of my asexual identity and the fact that like my identity is marginalized within the LGBTQ identity and particularly within like LGBTQ like black BIPOC spaces because it's just not well known. And of course that's not like the fault of the community for not knowing. It's a relatively recent phenomenon, so I understand that. At least the vocabulary we have now is recent. So when you have spaces like the Black and Brown Queer Camp, that's happening this June that y'all should sign up for if you're watching, by the way. Quick plug. That your very own Jahnice started and created and maintained, period. I was a part of that for several years, and I think that was a space for me of like healing, a space of like, listen, man, we got gripes and we have like chips on our shoulders, and this is a safe space, a brave space to just sit and talk about that. So I guess like in terms of acceptance, I think that's one area where I feel a lot of acceptance.
For me, I don't really have a ton of experience in queer spaces. Um, but Citywide definitely like getting involved with them. I kind of developed a friend group that are made up of queer people of color, and I feel like I haven't noticed how important that is until like really thinking about it recently. I went to a middle school that was majority people of color, queer people, they were people of color, but I wasn't out yet. Um, but it's very important to bring, especially into queer spaces and conversations about the LGBTQ community, the topics of class and race. Because oftentimes, especially in national media, movies, literature, books, what you get is oftentimes a white middle to upper class gay cis man, where the entire storyline or the climax is when they come out and ever after, but conversations about race and class, and especially about the gay liberation movement in the past, how they have excluded Black and brown people as well. So I think a part of making space, yeah, I love Simon. Yeah. So I think a part of making queer spaces more inclusive of Black and brown people is teaching Black and brown queer history. And also really being intolerant of homophobia, and not just homophobia, but racism and classism as well. And really opening that conversation, because conversations around race and class tend to be charged and people don't like to get into those conversations, but they're so needed, because a lot of Black and brown queer folks are not just queer, they're also working class and they're a Black and brown person. So really it's about literature, intersectionality, and having open and honest conversations about race and class in these spaces, and being intolerant of homophobia and racism and classism. Because all of these identities mix and match, they're all intersectional. They're not all mutually exclusive from each other.
Yes. Thank you both. The next question, right? And getting a bit more into the politics of it all, right? This has been a trying legislative session across the country, right? There has been over about 75 anti-trans bills that have been introduced through legislature across the country. And there's, so much more to expect out of the right-wing field when it comes to politics and like queer identities, right? So if you could right now send a message to legislatures across the country around protecting LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ youth rights, what would your message be? And either of you could start.
By saying, listen, get your stuff together, and stop relying on this idea that we're just going to continually progress as we go on, because we have seen waves of relative acceptance followed by these giant spikes of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation. And so it really isn't enough to go on Instagram or go on Twitter and say hashtag stand against hate or hashtag we see you, because politicians have the power to stop this, at least publicly, and they have a duty to exercise that power. And so what really gets to me is, like recently there was Trans Visibility Day, and you see politicians talking about we see you, we understand you, but they're not willing to take action. They're not willing to publicly defend LGBTQ lives and trans people when they're facing the brunt of attacks from bills like in Arkansas of anti-trans bills that bans minors from seeking gender-affirming healthcare. That's so necessary to them. So get your stuff together, or else you'll be kicked out. That's what I gotta say, because the people are not gonna take it any longer. There's a certain threshold until the safety valve just pops.
Mia. You're muted. Mia, you're muted.
You're muted. I'm sorry, y'all. My fault. I was gonna say I have a different perspective on this, and I might shake some tables, but I mean, you politicians can keep on doing what you're doing. You want to know why? Because we're gonna vote you out in 2 years anyway. On a 1 year. I mean, we're doing the elections again soon anyway. And guess what? Most of Gen Z is 18 now. Did you see those numbers for Biden's election? And you think we're not going to do that for you? We can vote now, mama. So you can go ahead. You can do that. You can keep making all those anti-trans bills, and we're just going to revolt. So keep your power, like have fun with your power while you have it.
Yes, voting is so important. There's so many people who are up for re-election, especially senators. So yes, I definitely encourage folks to take some time to do some phone banking and just call and make sure that folks are voting not only here in Connecticut but across the country. Okay, so back to nonprofit and creating spaces for young LGBTQ folks, right? Now, there's a lot to say about like the far right, and there's also a lot to say about Dems as well, right? And specifically Dems who lean more centrist and moderate, and often get in the way of very progressive policies, right? Now, a lot of this goes on within our own nonprofits. So the question is, how can we, as nonprofits who often operate from a centrist or moderate way of thinking, move to a more radical way of thinking? And I'll pass it to Mia first. Mia. Dave, you want to take this one?
Sure. I think definitely the first step is admit you have a problem. Really open up that discussion, open up that conversation. Because the fact is, being a centrist or a moderate is not going to do it, and a lot of people think it is. But centrism and moderates rely on the status quo. So the centrist right now is a extreme right winger because that's the state of our country right now. So nonprofits, in my opinion, that operate or have centrist and moderate viewpoints are not creating safe spaces for LGBTQ youth. So really talking about that out loud and taking the initiative to push more radical policies, I guess, more progressive or leftist or socialist, whatever you may call it, policies other than centrism and moderate liberalism. Because again, those rely on the status quo. And the status quo right now is a lot of anti-homophobia. It's a lot of anti-gayness. It's a lot of anti-trans. And there's no acceptance. So really getting rid of that centrist viewpoint of assimilation, that gay people should assimilate into culture, and giving queer people and queer youth resources through mutual aid, whether that may be communal housing, education, food, etc., that empower them, that give them the tools they need to fight for acceptance, not assimilation. So I'd say build mutual aid networks and really talk about it in your org and say being centrist and moderates is not a good strategy like we might think it is, because really we're just not creating a safe space for queer folk for their true liberation. We're just forcing them to assimilate.
Yes. Mia?
So your question is basically like, how do we get centrists to not have centric views effectively, right? So in a lot of, especially when I was younger, like not when I was, I don't know how to put this without like being wordy. In a lot of organizing spaces, when they tell you about like how to organize and things like that, there's a lot of like you're not trying to your biggest like obstacle is not like the far right, it's the centrists. And I think a big part of that I had to realize is like we don't think fundamentally the way centrists think. So it's really, for me, my mindset is it's more of a psychological thing. Like you need to understand their psychology and why they think. So our mindset, our mentality is, well, queer people are being treated terribly, treat them better, give them what they need, and XYZ and all that kind of stuff. They don't see it that way, right? It's like, here, we can give them, like, here's a comprehensive list of reasons why, like, we need to give queer people basic, and queer people of color, and poor queer people of color for that matter, basic human rights and all these kind of things. And it seems perfectly logical and reasonable to us. But for them, it's like, but why does this matter to me? Like, it helps you, but where do I benefit? And that whole like selfless altruistic thing of like, by helping us, by helping you, we're getting something back. They don't think that way, right? So the thing with centrists is that the really like terrible thing is that the thing is that they're happy with the way things are. They're satisfied with the status quo, which means they don't see any real incentive to make any changes, which is the biggest reason why I think in the organizing world we struggle with trying to get them on our side. And it's why we struggle with trying to get them to see our viewpoint, because as far as they're concerned, everything is fine. Like, who cares if trans people are dying? Who cares if like this person got kicked out of their home and like LGBT homelessness is at an all-time high? Who cares if trans women die at 35? And this is not meant to be like triggering. It's meant to be like, this is literally their, and it's shitty, right? Like, I hate that this is the way it is, but it's like, this is fundamentally how they think. So what you, instead of appealing to them in terms of like helping us helps you, which I think is a common thing in the spaces that we're in, I think we have to do more of like, I wouldn't say meet them halfway, but I think almost like changing the sales pitch in a way, in terms of like, hey, listen, like this is how this benefits you too, or like this is how it affects you directly. Because if I'm just like Steven from marketing and like I'm only caring about my marketing and like my job and my family, like I don't feel any incentive to take time to care about like LGBT issues or things like that, right? And if I'm like working at like a family foundation of some sorts or something like that, where it's like our goal is to just give money to people, don't give me that look. It's just like there's no shade, right? Like, it doesn't affect us directly because we don't have LGBT family members. We don't have LGBT friends. We don't know anyone who spent the last 4 years of their life on the street because somebody, like, their parents will not accept them for who they are. That's not their experience. So expecting them to be able to understand that experience it's kind of odd in a psychological sense. You know what I mean? So I think in terms of that, I think it's a matter of just like better understanding the psychology of a centrist. Why are they so ambivalent? Why are they so apathetic? And then trying to address that.
Yes. And you brought up something that's so important, right? Like this whole idea of the status quo, right? And like the biggest thing that we were hearing during the Trump administration was like this wanting to go back to normal, right? And like, oh, I wish we could go back to how things were before, right? But the reality is that for trans people like myself, for black and brown folks, for queer folks, right, normal was never okay. And normal should never be okay, right? So now, and voted for Biden, but the biggest fear of voting for Biden was that sense of going back to normal because I knew that normal was also never okay, right? And like my hope was that with a different candidate, we could create a new normal, right? And a new way of living that wasn't that. But we are here with the Biden administration and doing our best to move our agenda forward. So my question is, if there was 3 policy points or 3 areas of focus that you think, as a queer young person, the Biden administration should focus on, what would those 3 areas be for you? And I'll start with Dave.
Jahnice, you can't do this to me. I mean, the first thing I think is public safety, especially. Because that comes up to mind because not only does it affect queer people, but it also affects a lot of Black and brown people, Black and brown and queer people, where the police have been used as tools to enforce the status quo. And so abolishing the police and replacing it with social safety networks that really keep queer people safe is so crucial to letting people live, and letting them keep their dignity deserved since the beginning. Because you see a lot of queer folks get rejected, disowned by their family, and kicked out on the street, and then they fall into a system, a cycle of poverty, where even the police criminalize them for being poor, where they have nowhere to go, they might be rejected at shelters, they can't find a job, they can't be in education. It's all a cycle. It's not just a matter of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. And the police is a way of keeping them in that cycle of poverty. So definitely public safety. And I kind of touched on this second one, and that's social services, right? Not only governmental services, but giving the resources and the money and the tools to like communities build their own mutual aid networks that are autonomous and owned by the community, because administrations come and go, and network can go just like that as soon as the tide shifts more right wing or more centrist. So public safety, social services, and the third one, that one's a tricky one. I don't know that one. I definitely say education. We've seen like what happened with the AIDS crisis, where the government was completely negligent and let a lot of queer people die on purpose. And so education is so vital, especially, for example, sex education in schools. Queer people do not get adequate sex education in schools. It's all focused on cis and heterosexual couples. And even that kind of education is not effective for them either. So providing queer people with an adequate education, and not just for them, but for the community and for families, to teach them the systems that we live in now, this cis hetero patriarchy is not normal. It's never existed forever. It's a social construct, and I think that really needs to be nailed in people's heads, because queer people are seen as deviants, as opposed to humans. They're seen as deviants to normal society, and so education and people unlearn that is so crucial to our acceptance, and to our acceptance, because again, we don't want to assimilate, right? And teaching them that even before North America and South America was colonized, there would be third genders, and they were often praised and respected in their communities. And that homosexuality is not this sort of deviant or other category. That is a normal thing. So public safety, social service networks and mutual aid networks, and education for the individual and the community, I think is very important. And I'd really like to see Biden administration and local governments really address that as soon as they can, because queer people are dying, like, now.
Thank you. Mia, your 3 areas of policy you think the administration should focus on?
I think the policy, and that includes reparations within that, intersectionality, and that entails every aspect. Like, when we talk about intersectionality, we're usually only hit on like the big three: race, class, gender. But like there are others within that. There's sexuality is usually within gender, but they're different. But like what language do you speak? Religion, ability, where like geographic level, things like that also need to be a part of the conversation, and we don't really talk enough about that. And third, I don't know, like the anti-trans stuff, man. Like, what are you doing with the anti-trans bills? Like, that's horrible. I think, I don't know if there's like a policy, but like just investing in more like LGBTQ and trans in particular folks who do not fall within the gender binary, because like they need protection, they need to be heard, they need to be listened to, pass the mic to them. um Anything from as simply as like referring to them by their names and using pronouns to like, yo, like, how can I use my privilege to help you get where you need to go? You know what I mean? Anti-racist and I would say pro-black, but I don't want to get framework, very like intersectional framework, because everything affects everything. Yes, I said it. No, it's no shade. Like pro-blackness, right? Um, Honoring people that like that built this country, that came before us, that struggled. Um, and it's very hard because like I don't think of it in terms of like strict policy. I think of it as more like, this is what y'all need to do to be better and make this world better. And also y'all gotta stop like discarding the global south. Like, not like environmentalism is also important, because like the people who are affected the most by climate change are people that come from the colonized, the I hate the term the third world, the global south, because like a lot of this is like big companies in the global north collectively who are doing horrible things, who have done horrible things and continue to do horrible things to the global south, and that is the reason why our planet's dying. So and that of course is BIPOC people, black and brown bodies, indigenous bodies, and you're killing us and you're killing the world along with it, and you really need to stop doing that. Like, you actually need to stop doing that.
Now, one of the mothers of the LGBTQ rights movement, one of our amazing ancestors, Marsha P. Johnson, has a very famous tagline, and it says, "No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us," right? We have seen how the Pride movement has sort of shifted away from what it was at the very beginning. And it's no longer the sort of like fight for liberation. And we can have conversations around like how, the LGBTQ movement, once the equal marriage law was passed, it was like, okay, we're done. But there's been so much that has shifted. And by the way, there's an amazing book that folks should read called The Tea is Not Silent by Andrea Jenkins, which was the first trans Black woman to be elected to be a councilwoman in Minneapolis. The book is amazing and a great read. So definitely recommend that. But yeah, so how do you respond as young people who, I know both of you are like heavy on research and have, definitely looked into the gay rights movement before, right? And like what it was then to what it is now. So how what's the difference that you see? And what do you think we could do to get back to what it was?
A little bit.
Yeah, so as people who have studied, and Mia, you've done whole workshops on like what the gay rights movement was to what it is now. Um, what are the differences that you have noticed between the gay rights movement in the 60s to the gay rights movement now? And with those differences, how could we get back to what it was before?
I still have a lot to learn, but you know, just by the principle of it, like you kind of brought it up, like gay marriage was the end all be all. And another thing is pride movements, the pride movement before and even now is kind of parades around with this false sense of victory and prolonged victory, right? But really, again, that usually applies to middle to upper class cis white people. Um, and so I think what it will take to kind of get back to a radical movement, like you mentioned, Jahnice, like with the Stone in like the 60s, is building a one, really, and keeping ourselves informed that we don't fall into this cycle of false victory that really has never gotten here. And really, in my eyes, liberation is anti-capitalism. It's the dismantlement of capitalism, because we see a lot the pride movement being commercialized and commodified by companies with vague statements like on June with the rainbow logos and all that, and really making our new movements messy, making it grassroots, making sure it isn't commodified, making sure that we don't let establishment politicians and people tell us that it's a bad slogan, as we've seen like with the defund the police movement. So really avoiding co-opting and compromise, I believe, because I don't think there should be compromise in true liberation, because that's just the baseline. Being free is just the baseline, and compromising with that isn't being free. So building a new working class led and black and brown led movement against the systems of power that are in place, whether that's colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, etc. It needs to be black and brown folks, and it cannot be co-opted. It cannot be commodified. It cannot be taken by establishment politicians and companies. And so staying true to message, I guess, to it, staying true to that message is so important, because once you let one person or one company, one individual, whatever, kind of try to change the message, it just opens it up to other attacks and co-optations. So really stick to your message. True liberation is anti-capitalism. And I said it, and I will say it again.
Mia, anything to add?
I still have a lot to learn as well, so I'm still just kind of a baby in this. My analysis has like changed over time, and it is always evolving. But I think for where I'm at this moment in time, I would even argue like I guess it's hard for me because like I was born in the 21st century, so like by today's standards, like what they radicals like this is normal. Like they're humans who need to be treated as humans. Like what's radical about that, you know? And then when you look at it with the contextual lens of like the historical time, it's like, okay, that gay liberation movement was radical. And I think there is a difference because we've expanded now. We have never had before. Those people existed, but we didn't have language for them back then. Now we have more language and we're developing more language. Pansexual, bisexual, non-binary, like agender, bigender, like all these new terms, supiosexual, capiosexual, like you know what I mean? And I love that people were gaining language. Of course, also technology, because now we're able to like look at us, like we're on a screen from different parts of the East Coast like coming together. I think we underestimate how much technology has really shifted our lives, right? And we've seen more history happen between 1969 and today, this very day, and history continues to be made. So we have more history to learn from. And we have like a bigger arsenal to take from. We've had more leaders rise up, right? We've had more rioting, for God's sake. Like last summer was like a reckoning, you know what I mean? That I see it as, at least. I think, and there's more, I think people are more courageous now. Like I'm seeing younger people like 9 and 10, and they're like, yo, I'm fighting for liberation, man. Like, let's get popping. Like, let's get to it, you know? Like, Dave, you're what, 14? and you've already a veteran in this work, that's amazing. Like, we have people, I think now more than ever, who are like willing to do this work. They're more willing to put their bodies on the line. They have an understanding of what this entails, and they're ready to take on the challenge. And I think in some ways it has changed, and in some ways it's the same, because we're fighting for the same things that we were fighting for in 1969, and before that, for that matter. Like, we want to be treated as humans. We want to walk freely in our bodies. We want to express ourselves however feels good to us without getting shot or without going to jail. And we'd like adequate health care. We would like to express ourselves the way we want to. We want hormones that don't cost $10,000 in an arm and a leg and a foot. Like, we want surgeries that don't cost a down payment on a fucking house. Like, these, like, and they wanted that too back in the day. You know what I mean? Like, also like healthcare for all, but that's a whole other conversation. Like Dave said, we want anti-capitalism, because why the hell do we have billionaires, like, and people are struggling? Like, why? Like, why do police exist? Why are we locking up people for and like fucking up communities and fucking up families? Like why are we doing that again? How far has that gotten us, sis? How far has that gotten you, sis? Is our country the greatest? I hope it's gotten you far, sis. But like, things like that, you know what I mean? And it's still happening, and it needs to stop, you know what I mean? Also, we should be more communist, but that's just, you know, anarchist for that matter. But like,
Our final question. We often hear a lot about identity politics, representation, so on and so forth. So exactly how important is representation when it comes to media, politics, nonprofits, leadership, all of that good stuff? How important is representation in these areas? And I'll start with Dave to close us off. Mia, would you like to go?
Yeah, I mean, representation is very, very, very important for me, at least. I think the part that like I've come to realize is that it's not just me. Everyone is entitled to representation that's meaningful for them, and that might not be the same for everybody. So when I look at media and I see something that doesn't look like it's for me, I used to get really upset about it, and then I remember that like not everything is for everybody. And there are more and more things coming up that are available for me specifically. And I have more things to look at now than ever before. And like the queer kids, the queer BIPOC kids coming up, listen, man, they're coming out with new shows like so often, and like new shit, and it makes me so happy that like y'all have more representation now than ever. We still have a ways to go, but like it's definitely more than was like 10, 20 years ago. And I am so happy that y'all have as much as y'all have. You know what I mean? And we can all just pretend like Love Simon doesn't exist. Anyways, like I just am so sad. Like, it really does make me happy, like, jokes aside. I think that representation is in the eye of the beholder, like beauty. So I think if you want representation to happen, I think at a certain level it's on you to make that happen in some way, shape, or form. Because like, it sounds cliche, but I do think that we're all the master of our own destinies, and I think we are all capable of making a life for ourselves, as much as we can, despite the fact that white supremacy keeps her foot on our necks all the time. But, you know, and classism and capitalism, and insert every institution ever here. But like, as much as we can, trying to like thrive in that. And I think representation is one way that like we can thrive in that if needed. So I think representation is incredibly important, and it's ever expanding, and the definition is ever evolving across time and space. So
Well, on board with Mia, yes. I think representation is absolutely crucial, not for the individual, but humanization of queer people as a whole. Because right now, queer people are seen as less than human. Again, we're seen as deviants, as if something was wrong with us. And I think media is very important in changing that perspective, especially to really humanize us and show people that, you know, we have thoughts and feelings and aspirations and goals and dreams and family and friends. And I know when I see someone that looks like me who's queer in media, it makes me very happy. It's so important, but it definitely isn't the end all be all. Liberation is not looking at people that look like us on TV. It's a important part of it, but it isn't the end all be all and post goal, big victory. And in respects to identity politics, that one's also kind of a weird subject because I feel like when people have issues with identity politics, it's really often Black or brown or other marginalized peoples who participate in the systems of capitalism and imperialism of the United States. Because we see this emphasis on Black and brown people, women, and other marginalized peoples getting into government. But in my eyes, that isn't the only thing that needs to be done. It should be, I think, people that do look like you, but also have the same lived experiences as you, because there is an element of classism in today's, quote, identity politics as well, that detaches that person from the rest of their community. So it's there's a lot of nuances, like with everything. Nothing is ever black and white. There's always a lot of complexities, but identity politics really, the identity of a person plays so much in policy making and in government. And so I think it is important to have people that look like you, that are part of your community in the government, because if they are like you, they have the same lived experiences as you. They can represent you. But at the same time, they should be radical. They should be able and willing to take on the initiative to dismantle the systems of oppressive powers that are in place right now. Black and brown people, disabled people, and other marginalized communities oppressed and down. So a lot of nuances, definitely. Identity is super important, but it shouldn't stop at centrism. It has to go way beyond.
Thank you. I would like to thank our panelists for joining us today for this conversation on creating radical spaces and a radical world for queer young people. I'd like to thank the ASL interpreters for making this conversation accessible to everyone as well. Thank you to outCT and the New Haven Pride Center for this opportunity. Thank you to everyone who was watching and listening to the conversation. And yeah, with this, we say goodbye. Bye, everyone.
For having